two things struck me about the speech from a foreign policy perspective. One was in the domestic section, because there was a very interesting tone, especially from a president and a party that speaks of a kind of cosmopolitan understanding of the world and how, we're all in this together and globalization. It was an intensely competitive speech, competitive with everybody else in the world. We are going to compete. I think from my point of view, I don't think the word democracy appeared more than once or twice in the speech. The word compete, I can only assume, appears 50 times. And almost to the point of it being a zero-sum kind of conversation. We have to out-innovate. We have to out-educate. They're educating better. We have to educate even better. It's almost as if we don't want them to educate as well. Let's educate better than they are. I mean, I used to think it's good if everybody in the world is educated, but there was a very combative American, we got to beat all these guys. Win the future. That's an interesting phrase, by the way. I don't particularly think it's a very mellifluous phrase, but as a speech phrase, but win the future is an interesting kind of thing, again, for a cosmopolitan president. So that was the sort of overall tone, I would say. That was the most important foreign policy tone, actually, more important than the foreign policy section itself. The foreign policy section itself, I'm sure the guy who's in charge of writing the foreign policy part of the speeches drank heavily after the evening was over. Was probably glad that it snowed today, and because I feel for that person. The one thing that I think was even remotely in the nature of visionary or had some kind of grander thoughts was the brief paragraph on Tunisia, which was unfortunately ruined in my mind by the failure to mention the actual current riots going on in another country, which was Egypt. Now, I think it took a lot of doing, and I don't think many presidents giving State of the Union would have had the discipline not to mention the fact that there were currently unprecedented protests in Egypt that very day. They had plenty of time to put it in. They put stuff in these speeches 5 minutes before he gives them. They had all day to mention it. Now, I think their version of mentioning it was a kind of brief shout-out, which you guys didn't even hear. Things are happening in Tunisia, and we support that, and anybody else who's doing that kind of stuff around the world. It was striking, because that's a decision. It's one thing to say we're not going to emphasize foreign policy. It's a decision not to mention the actual events that are occurring right then as the speech is given, which, by the way, would have gotten a good round of applause. And I would say that's indicative of the fact that this administration is really twisted around like a pretzel on the issue of supporting democracy. They are still, to my amazement, it's as if George W. Bush has reached out of the presidential grave and grabbed this administration by the throat and convinced them that they can never look like they're supporting democratic change.